Greetings to all. I want to read a few verses from the book of Jude. It's the place where we stopped the last time. And I want to pick up a few thoughts again on some of the issues that are perplexing the church, the world, and humanity as a whole. The book of Jude says, it just has one chapter, so we don't have to say which chapter it is. I, Jude, am a slave to Jesus Christ and brother to James, writing to those loved by God the Father, called and kept safe by Jesus Christ. Relax, everything's going to be all right. Rest, everything's coming together. Open your hearts, love is on the way. Dear friends, I have dropped everything to write about this life of salvation that we have in common. I have to write insisting, begging that you fight with everything you have in you for this faith entrusted to us as a gift to God and cherish. What has happened is that some people have infiltrated our ranks. Our scriptures warned us that this will happen. Who beneath the pious skin are shameless scoundrels. Their design is to replace the sheer grace of God with sheer license, which means doing away with Jesus Christ, our one and only Master. Verse 5, I'm laying this out as clearly as I can, even though you once knew all this well enough and shouldn't need reminding. Here it is in brief. The Master saved a people out of the land of Egypt. Later he destroyed those who defected. And you know the story of the angels who didn't stick to the post, abandoning it for others, darker missions. Abandoning it for other darker missions. But they are now chained and jailed in a black hole until the great judgment day. Remember Sodom and Gomorrah, which went to sexual wreck and ruin along with the surrounding cities that acted just like them. Another example, burning and never burning up. They still serve as a stock warning. This is exactly the same program of those latest infiltrators. Dirty sex, rule, and rulers thrown out, glory dragged in the mud. In the last episode, I told you that Jude had to drop his pen because of some breaking news that took place. Now, I don't know whether he knew about this before he started to write this letter, or while he was writing, he dipped his pen into another type of ink, the ink of warning, and to speak to his people in the church to brace themselves up and to fight and to contend for the faith. But the way it seems as if it was breaking news, Jude was writing about common salvation, how we are saved from sin, and to encourage the church. But suddenly, there was some breaking news. And the breaking news is this. He encapsulated this in these words. Some people have infiltrated our ranks. Some people have infiltrated our ranks. Now, I marvel at these men of God, the early church fathers, and the writers of the books of the Bible, the prophets of old, and the apostles later on. I marvel at the keen eye, the sharp eye that they had for the devil. In fact, you will see that God can never use you or me, you or I, if we do not have a keen sense of sharpness for the devil. We must not be swallowed up with what's happening even in the church. We must ask questions. In fact, I've been using illustrations about this pandemic and this coronavirus to see through using the virus to see through what God is telling us. And there are people right now that are tracking the virus. Even as I speak, they're giving you updates. Every 24 hours, they're updating this news, where the virus is, where the epicenter is. Not only the epicenter where the epicenter is in South Africa, I'm talking in South African circles now, but where the epicenter is in our country. Not only that, they zero it into a small town and they can tell you which village is the epicenter, which street is the epicenter. That means someone is tracking. Someone is tracking and tracing the evolution of this pandemic. For what reason? For simple reasons that because we have no vaccines that are available right now, of any kind, vaccines of any kind right now, as I speak, they are doing testings, yes, but there are no vaccines, and the only way then to deal with this is by tracing it and by tracking it. And when you track it, find out the people that have been contaminated or have been in the vicinity of this virus. And this is the keen eye these men of God had. Don't ever even think of being used by God if you don't develop a keen sense of where the devil is. Not only just sin, but where the devil is. So the breaking news seems to be this. He was writing about common salvation, but at the same time his scanners were on involuntary, because they by default had a keen sense of smell of where the devil is. And it seems like he put his pen down abruptly and he says, men, some people have infiltrated our ranks. In fact, those type of people in the church are a blessing. It's not the people that can preach necessarily. It's not the people that have memorized the Bible necessarily. If you ever need someone in the church, I'm talking to pastors and leaders. Firstly, we must have a keen eye for the devil and a keen sense of smell, of tracking where he is. But it will be a blessing for men of God and pastors and leaders of any sort in the church to have people under them that can track where the devil is. So while he was wanting to speak about common sin, the scanners picked up and it read, and it was projected on a screen, as it seems. Some people have infiltrated our ranks. Satan has infiltrated our ranks. Pseudo-apostles have infiltrated our ranks. Leonard Ravenhill said this very beautifully. In fact, I can't quote it like he said it, but I'll give you the gist of it. And he was speaking about some things about the church, and he said one pastor spoke to him and he says, Leonard, if the devil left the church, if the Holy Spirit left the church, we would not make it out. We would still carry on with normal programs because there is no keen eye of detecting the whereabouts of Satan. I consider this to be one of the greatest misfortune of the church, that we do not have trackers. We have pulpit hungry people. Oh yes. We have people vying for leadership. Yes, plenty of them. A dozen a dime. But do we have these few people that can track exactly where Satan is? That's the background of this one chapter. As if Jude, the brother of Jesus and the brother of James, was born and bred for this one chapter, to locate the enemy. So he says, some people have infiltrated our ranks unawares. Different versions says this. He says, Satan has wormed its way into the church, wiggled its way into the church, unsuspecting. We lived in a generation, I think most of us at this point in time lived in that generation when 19 people posed as normal people that were taking a flight innocently from one city to another city in America. But later we found out that these people had sinister motives. They were carrying some things into the case that fitted the requirements of the airport and aviation. They carefully packed the bag to such a degree that they could not have been suspected or noticed that they had sinister motives. Now you watch the CCTV cameras in retrospect, and they show you these people, obviously, which are now dead, and have smashed those planes into strategic places in America to wreak a havoc in America. But when you watch it in retrospect, they show you the innocent man at customs, at the airport. They can even go further back to probably their hotels. They can even go further back. One day before, they traced one of these people that were dancing in a family function. Nothing was wrong. And that's how they carry on. Some people have infiltrated our ranks unawares. That virus, and like we know, which needs no repetition, we know how it infiltrates. And people are the carriers of this. The virus can't move. People are the carriers of this virus. When we move, the virus will move. And let me tell you here today that some people have infiltrated our churches. Some of them have been hiding there for a long time. You can almost remember the day. You can remember the meal that you were eating when the first news hit the television cameras, where the first plane hit the first of the Twin Towers. You could almost know what meal you were, what you were eating, who you were sitting with, what type of weather it was. You could smell the environment. And when I read the book of Jude, I can almost feel as if Jude can recall this with a smell, with a taste, and a sharp, keen sense of tracking the devil. Men of God, if we are not trackers, if we just spend our time visiting people, taking care of the needs, make sure that they are comfortable, and we do not track where the devil is. And I'm about to say our churches will be smaller, but sometimes the contrary happens. It will get bigger in number in most cases. But the devil is comfortable hiding inside those numbers. What is the purpose of these men infiltrating the ranks into the church? Like these 9/11 hijackers, they reach certain goals. How to pass the customs in the airport. But that was not the end. But it was the first step. How to go through those customs undetected. And that's why Jude uses this phrase. Some people infiltrated our ranks unawares. Now, it can be you who I'm speaking to. But the first part, I'd like to address it to the people that have to be trackers and warners. Men of God that are burdened for their sheep, burdened for the flock. They have no other intention, no other desire in this life and in this church world, but to see that God's purposes are accomplished. So I'll be addressing you, and especially also to those that have sinister motives and sinister intentions. Now, I want to say this at the outset, that when you read these scriptures in the book of Jude and in the book of Peter, when it talks about God spared not the angels that sinned, and God spared not the people in Noah's time. And then he talks about Sodom and Gomorrah also, like in the book of Jude. Jesus also refers to Sodom and Gomorrah in many ways. He gives a warning to the people of his generation. In Matthew chapter 10, I think it is, when he's sending his disciples out, if I can recall correctly. He says, you'll be rejected by some people because of your message. Because your message is straight, your message is clear, you do not mince words, you're not playing with them. Don't go there soliciting a meal with them or some fellowship with them and how you can befriend them so you could go up the ranks. You are different. But he says you're going to meet people that will throw you out. He says, but shake the dust off your feet. He says, I tell you, don't worry what they say. I tell you beforehand, it'll be more tolerable. This is where the phrase comes. It'll be more tolerable for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah on Judgment Day than for them. So preach the message. Preach it clear. Preach it straight. Preach it simple. Don't preach for fame. Don't preach for contact lists. Don't preach so that you can have better contact numbers and go high in ranks with humanity. Preach it so that these people that infiltrate the church can be dealt with timelessly. Now South Africa the world is dealing with this pandemic and this virus in particular. And we know the story very well that it's very hard to contain this virus, although that is the mode that the world is in and South Africa is in. It's containing this virus. But in containing these viruses, we are accomplishing a few things. One of the things we are accomplishing is we're delaying the peak of this virus. We cannot ultimately annihilate it. We have no vaccines. But we can quarantine people, and by quarantining the people, or to have the people in quarantine, you can quarantine the virus subsequently. So that's the only way, that's the only option we have, and hence the different methods and the different words and the phrases we are hearing. In other words, or phrases like this, like only essential workers must go to work. One of the ways we do it. So many people, there's a limit on people to attend a certain gathering. What is the reason for that? To slow the death rate? Yes. But the language is to delay the peak. And when you go back to see how God dealt with certain people he just destroyed them. Sodom and Gomorrah, he destroyed them. But when you come to the book of Genesis chapter 11, and that's after the flood in Genesis chapter 6, after the sin of Adam and Eve at the beginning, and then God had to contend with Genesis chapter 6. The angels were changing their ranks and cohabiting with human beings, however you would understand that verse. And then a few chapters later, chapter 11. In fact, it's no surprise that the time period of Genesis chapter 1 to chapter 11 is the same time period from chapter 11 to where we are now. So Genesis chapter 1 to chapter 11 covers a number of years, centuries. And yet Genesis 11 marks something that made God take a different stance, because he realized there'll be no man left if I have to deal with this properly. When man was building the Tower of Babel, what's the purpose? The very sole purpose was to reach God. Why would they want to reach God? Because if they had an intention to reach God, as you and I would speak here today as Christians, we would say, I'd like to be where God is. I'd like to be in the place of thinking what God is thinking. That would be plausible. There's nothing wrong with that. But this was not the case. God would not have come down if they had good motives of trying to reach God. In some ways, we are trying to reach God. Maybe not literally in a sense, but we are trying to serve God and to pattern ourselves after Jesus Christ that came down to earth and lived as man. That's not the problem. What is the problem there? The problem was this, that they wanted to equalize themselves with God. When God saw this, the same problem with Adam and Eve. That was the promise to Eve. What was the promise to Eve? God knows that when you eat this, you'll be like him. You will know the range of good and evil. Now you're limited. God has placed a limitation on you because he wanted you not to see everything. The same thing happened in Genesis 11. But Genesis chapter 1, chapter 3, God spared man. God could not kill his creation. Genesis chapter 6, God spared a family. One family alone and annihilated the rest. Came to chapter 11, a similar circumstance. The similar intention rose up, howbeit different circumstances. And God says, no, I'll have to deal with the situation again. You cannot be equal to me. You cannot reach me in that sense. And let me tell you that man wants to be like God. The only way man can carry on with his own business, whatever it is, the only way man can carry on with his business is to equalize himself with God, or to climb up the ladder and use the platform of God to carry on and carry out his sinister intentions. I remember the story of David when his son Absalom was wanting to know from what one of his father's counselors, David's counselors, which Absalom saw that this counselor gave great advice to my father. And so he had a consultation with him and he said, hey, Ahithophel, how can I get my father's throne? How can I? And Ahithophel gave the same advice that we are seeing here in Genesis 11. He says, the only way you can get your father's throne is by neutralizing your father. And the only way to neutralize your father in this circumstance is go and sleep with his wives in broad daylight. I'm afraid that's the breaking news of the church. That man is using the church, using the medium of the church and God to perpetrate his sinister intentions, to achieve his ego, his goal, his lust for sex, his lust for money. As shocking as it sounds, they will infiltrate the church and use church constitutions, church guidelines, the parameters of the church. It's the safest place. And not only it's the safest place, it's the only place that has the greatest power. And they will do that. And so Absalom did that. And David ran for his life to such a degree that he walked barefoot across the mountains. On the mountain barefoot he cried. And the crying was not that he was ousted as king. The cry was, my son wants to be like me. And here God is looking at his children. In Genesis 11, he says, you know what? My creation, dirt that I took from the dust, from the ground, I had no other intention, and suddenly I thought, let me make something out of this dust. And God blew his breath And now that dust is climbing the same ladder of God. And when this dust reaches the top of this ladder, this dust kicks off the ladder from underneath its feet and does what it wants to do. This is the breaking news Jude gives. But let me get back to Genesis 11 just to take this point and get back to Jude. God delayed the peak. God killed no one in Genesis chapter 11. In Genesis 1, punishment came. In Genesis 6, destroyed the whole world at that time, save one family with 8 people. Genesis 11, he says, I can't do that again. But this is what I'll do. I'll delay the peak. If God did not delay the peak, and he delayed the peak, we all know very well, by confusing the languages of people. Gave man some time. Not that God was playing for some time, because man was destroying himself fast. So God had to help man to delay the peak of what he was doing and how he was thinking. If God did not delay the peak at that time by confusing the languages so that people could not communicate with one another, and to slow down the rate of what man is trying to do so that people could find their own ways and separate and disperse, God delayed the peak for man, the peak of intelligence. And that intelligence was sinister intelligence. Man would have been flying planes centuries ago. Men would have been cloning human beings centuries ago had he not delayed that peak. Man would have obliterated himself centuries ago, would have missed the incarnation of Jesus Christ, which is the only hope for this world. That's the dilemma in Jude. And they infiltrated the ranks for what purpose? He says it very clearly. And I want to take this phrase here today. He says, some people have infiltrated our ranks who beneath the pious skin are shameless scoundrels. This is the purpose. Their design is to replace the sheer grace of God with sheer license, which means doing away with Jesus Christ, our one and only Master. Can you fathom what's taking place here? That they come into this church like you and I, but they're pseudo-apostles. They worship like you, they sing like you, they read the Bible like you. That is their ploy. That is how they come in. That is the modus operandi. But when they come in, the Bible says Jude was a tracker. When they come in, they start to move like how the virus moves. When it has been carried by one person to the other person, now it gets into the system and locks itself up into the respiratory system because it has the same type of structure, physical structure, that suits this virus to lock into that. So they open another bag, so as to speak. Another bag, so as to speak. And when they open this bag, this is what's in this bag. It says, their design, that's what we read, their design is to replace the sheer grace of God, that's how the Message Bible puts it, with sheer license. And then it says, which means, this is what it boils down to, which means, the Bible says, doing away with Jesus Christ, our one and only Master. Every intention of sin in the church is to dethrone God and to replace God. I look at this and I like to term this another form of replacement theology. In the church circles, it is not uncommon to know the phrase called replacement theology. It's used to this effect that some church Christian scholars believe that the Jews, God's first people, have been replaced with the church, by the church. It's no more the Jewish people anymore. It's the church that has taken over. Everything that was meant for the Jewish people has now been handed over in principle in a different way to the church. I don't hold that view. Lots of Christians hold that view. I don't hold that view. I think it's a view that allows the devil to creep in very easily into the church and to miss a very important doctrine and the teaching and the purposes of God to use the Jewish people for a final end. But that's not the topic today. I see another replacement. I see a replacement that's here. Exactly what Jude is talking about. He says, these people have come in for one purpose. Their design, and I'm quoting from the Message Bible, their design is to replace the sheer grace of God. Their aim, like how this virus tackles a certain spot and a certain organ of the body, the respiratory system, and shuts it down, and in so doing kills you. He says these people come with one targeted, specific intention. And their intention is that grace. That's where I can breathe that grace and hitch onto that grace and tell them that grace is giving us license to do what we want. You know the story. Paul says, God forbid. Should we continue in sin? God forbid. We know the stance on this. But these people come as pseudo-apostles and deal with that. And they come to replace this grace with license. And then it continues to say, which means the doing away with Jesus Christ, our one and only Master. In other words, even to replace God, the intention is not to stop just with license, just to give the church license. The intention is to do away with God. I've seen men in this generation, leaders, men that God has used mightily, that we are no comparison to how God used them compared to how God is using us. When they climbed up the ladder of God, when God put his ladder up, because they were nothing and they climbed. But when they reached the top of the so-called ladder, they kicked the ladder from underneath their feet to finally annihilate God. And that's why the atheist said, was it Nietzsche that said, God is dead? Because the only way to deal with your whims and fancies now is to equalize God and to annihilate him. I see that in the church. I see people like that infiltrating, and later on we see how they projecting their own egos. So whenever you leave your post, you only have one intention, and that is you're heading to neutralize the work of God. And that's what the devil did. The devil wanted to be like God. The people in the time of the building of the Tower of Babel wanted to reach God. They wanted to have to take the license and the liberty in doing what they want to. And in so doing, God had to do something about it. But God likens his people to some of the most horrific stories that happen in the Bible. He says these men can be likened to the men of Sodom and Gomorrah. These people can be likened to the angels that left the first estate. That's who they are likened to. These are horrible people. These are people that want to infiltrate our ranks and perpetrate what they want to do. And I like the words of Paul. It always echoes in my mind. And marvel not that Satan is transformed into the angel of light. When you think about that scripture, you know that Satan has mutated, and he can mutate, and he can change, and he has the propensity to change. He can take whatever form, whatever mode he wants to get into a church. He has a bag of many tricks to infiltrate a church. Pastor, today, is your church infiltrated with men that have changed their ranks? Who wants to replace God at the end of the day? I want to say something about Islam. It is one of the religions that we have to reckon with. They say that if the growth rate of Islam, if it carries on the way it is, it's going to overtake Christianity within a few years. We are still the biggest in number of adherents compared to Islam, but the rate of their conversion growth is greater than us. Well, birth rate also comes into play with the Muslims. But how did the sinister doctrine start? He did not appear. No angel appeared to this man, Muhammad. But this man had such an insatiable desire for sex, for money, and for fame, that he said, the only way I can express my human feelings is to wrap it in religion. Religion still remains the greatest force and the greatest power of anything ever known in this world. If you want to climb up, you have to dethrone God. So he concocted a story. He made up the story. And this story was so powerful that now they're reaching the same number of Christians. Why? Use religion. And the devil knows he has to use religion to reach this. One of his methods in dethroning God, or trying to reach and neutralizing God, is, I want to confuse the genes and the genetic makeup of the church. I'll use grace. I'll use what's there, but I'll overemphasize it. I'll give grace more license. I'll give grace more freedom because we are saved by grace. And in so doing, Christians can do what they want, as it seems, in a church. So what does he do? One of the first things he does, the devil does, is he mixes up ranks. Like we read in this verses here. It says, I'm laying this out as clearly as I can, verse 5. Even though you once knew all this well enough and shouldn't need reminding, here it is in brief. The master saved the people out of the land of Egypt. Later he destroyed those who defected. And you know the story of angels who do not stick to the post, abandon it for other darker missions. But they are now chained and jailed in a black hole until the great judgment day. Sodom and Gomorrah, which went into sexual wreck and ruin along with the surrounding cities that acted just like them, are another example. Burning and never burning up. They still serve as a stock warning. This is exactly the same program, verse 8, of these latest infiltrators. Dirty sex, rule and rulers, thrown out, glory dragged in the mud. This is the ploy, the very same ploy. They come mixing up with the others, mixing grace with license to do anything here. And while they're doing this, a new breed is born in the church. A breed that is not pure, it's hybrid. It's a mongrel nation. It's a nation that, if you look at it with one eye, it looks like the mother. When you look with the other eye, it looks perfectly like the father. And that's why it's so hard to detect a mongrel breed, a mixed breed. And the gospel gets confused. And the gospel gets mixed up. And it gets diluted. And the ranks are broken. But right through the book of Jude, you will see this phrase or this idea coming out. The angels that left their post. He's warning us not to leave our post. When you read certain versions, it says, those that left their principality or their principal dwelling or the first estate, the first place where God put you. You may not know how dangerous it is to leave that. It may look naive, it may look innocent. You're doing the same thing somewhere else, or you're doing another type of job besides what God called you, or you may be in another place where God called you, where you should not be. You may think it's naive and it's innocent, but God says you're developing a hybrid nation. He says, look at the devil that left their first estate. He says, you know why I put him straight into hell? Do you know why I marked out his parameters and say you will be in hell? It's only for one reason. It's because he left his rank. And sometimes we leave our rank thinking there are promises in the church for greater things. We don't want to submit to leaders that have a keen eye to where Satan is, because you don't like it. You don't like somebody telling you, watch your ways. Be careful, brother. You're moving too fast. Sister, watch what you're putting on your body or what you're not putting on your body. You don't like it. You don't like after what is a so-called good service when the pastor has to come to the door, or certain leaders that has a keen eye for where Satan is and tell you, cover up. You don't like it. My heart goes out to many pastors that suffer today with the loss of finance, with the loss of people. Not only that, they burn the midnight oil alone with just the wife and the children sometimes. That's if they have the children with them. And because they know when they go to bed, it's all because I said something right and something true and something honest, that I warned the church that Satan is there. And marvel not that Satan is transformed into the angel of light. My last words to you today, to the church, to the pastor, to leaders, is do not replace the sheer grace of God with sheer license.